Coronavirus is everywhere these days. All of the news channels have around-the-clock coverage, and the numbers of victims and the economic fallout are at shocking and unprecedented levels. Now, I'm like most of you. I receive information through my different news feeds, Facebook, and I try to piece it all together to figure out what the heck's happening. I cannot begin to predict how this will end or for how long it'll go on, but I do know that the one bright spot in all this has been the appreciation for those who are helping us get through this crisis. The work that the doctors and nurses have been doing while risking their lives day in and day out is incredibly brave, and I know that I personally see each of them as a hero helping to give people comfort during an unsure time. Even grocery store workers and nursing home aides have been identified as those placing themselves outside of quarantine and in the path of potentially being infected with COVID 19. I think another worker who needs to be appreciated during this crisis and even when this crisis ends is the farm worker and migrant workers who are ensuring that we're all fed. There are somewhere between 2 to 3 million migrant workers and farm workers in the US right now. These individuals include illegal and legal workers. Shockingly, though, human trafficking researcher Seth Kara found through interviewing laborers in California's agricultural valley that legal workers were just as likely to be victims of labor trafficking as illegal workers. So this is due to a broken visa system that ties the worker's ability to work in the country to a single employer. So this allows the employers to exploit workers who may have traveled thousands of miles from home and spent everything they had to get into the US legally. Now, the nonprofit organization Polaris found through their research that a majority of labor trafficking victims identified by the National Human Trafficking Hotline were in fact individuals who had a H-2A or H-2B visa. So this means that a majority of identified labor trafficking victims are individuals who came to this country legally, work hard, and ensure we are all constantly receiving a steady stream of food even during a crisis. Now, keep in mind, I'm not subjectively qualifying willing workers as labor trafficking victims just so I can make my point. The definition of a human trafficking victim is clearly defined by the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And that states that force, fraud, and coercion are criteria for someone being a victim. These individuals experience coercion and fraud in the form of having their passports taken away, being forced to pay for living quarters, which, according to the law, should be provided by the employer, and threatened with deportation. You might not be aware of this, though, because as Jamie Beck, the CEO of Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, asserted, labor trafficking victims are even more isolated from society than victims of sex trafficking. And we need to admit that as a country, we're simply not serving immigrants well. If you doubt that immigrant workers and farm workers alike are being treated like trash, please take this example into consideration. When World War II began and many of the nation's able-bodied men went to war, the federal government developed the Bracero program. That looked to have millions of farm workers from Central and South America keep the nation fed as the country dealt with a massive problem. These workers were so efficient and able to be paid such a low rate that the program lasted past wartime effort and didn't end until 22 years later in the 1960s. By 1965, newspapers across the country reported that Secretary of Labor William Wirtz wanted to recruit 20,000 high schoolers to replace the hundreds of thousands of Mexican agricultural workers who had labored in the United States under the Bracero program. The new program was titled the A-Team, and it targeted athletic teens who ultimately were unable to fill the gap. The students found that the garden gloves that the farmers gave them to help harvest land only lasted for 4 hours because the cantaloupes that they were harvesting had fine hairs and it made it feel like they were picking up sandpaper. For completing this work, they got the enormous sum of minimum wage, which was $1.40 an hour back then, plus 5 cents for every crate filled with about 30 to 36 fruits. They got breakfast that consisted of eggs and beans, and then bologna sandwiches that literally toasted in the heat, even in the shade, and that's according to Jeff Carter. Jeff Carter is one of the students who was in the A-Team, and he says that while the experience was tough, that it taught him to have empathy toward immigrant workers that he believes the rest of the country should learn, especially during these times. Needless to say, the A-Team only lasted that one summer before farmers nationwide turned back to depending on migrants and farm workers. Today, it is widely believed that farm workers in the United States face extreme occupational risks and exposures. They have a reduced life expectancy and suffer poorer than average health, At the same time, they experience many barriers to access in healthcare, like language differences, high cost, or transportation barriers. These are all issues that were present before the coronavirus epidemic, which has just been exacerbated since this has become a nationwide epidemic for all of these workers. In 2020, the farm worker population varies regionally across the entire country. However, overall, 78% of farm workers are Hispanic, with about 95% being of Mexican descent. The current political culture in the United States, though, does not set up an environment where this group feels inclined or able to access healthcare, regardless if there is a life threatening pandemic across the entire country. This is beyond just being unfortunate, as about 1 in 3 farm workers are citizens or legal residents of the United States. They are entitled to proper treatment. So, to wrap all of this up, we all recognize that people we depend on exist in many areas we never thought about before the coronavirus epidemic, including nursing home aides and grocery store employees. Hopefully, this video has helped to illuminate how critical the farm worker is to our way of life and how these individuals toil and work where they are likely to become labor trafficking victims or at best be exploited to do work that others were unable to perform for more than a single summer. These victims have been a critical piece to ensure we are all fed since at least the beginning of World War II over 70 years ago. Unfortunately, victims believe coming to be a farm worker in the U.S. through the legal visa system will offer them some sort of protection, but the H-2A and H-2B visas serve the corporate farm world far more than they serve the workers who are helping to keep us all safe and fed. Hopefully, someday, we can return the favor and ensure they are adequately taken care of too. Thank you for listening to Human Trafficking Hater. If you're interested in getting more content about human trafficking, how to address it, and how it impacts millions around the world, please subscribe and join us as we continue to hate human trafficking and raise awareness.